Welcome to This Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to guide you through today's topic. We're going to be looking at a genuinely thrilling story from the 2nd century, a time that served as an intense ideological crucible for a fledgling religion. Today, we're exploring the battle for institutional power, and specifically how a group known as the Proto-Orthodox managed to win early Christianity. So if you've ever wondered how the actual structure of Western religious history was formed, well, you are definitely in the right place.
Okay, let's dive into this. Traditionally, we're taught a myth. It's often called the Eusebian paradigm, and it claims that early Christianity started out as this pure, unified doctrine that was only later corrupted by so-called heresies. But if you look at the historical reality, it's a completely different story. Back in 1934, historian Walter Bauer published a groundbreaking revelation showing that this traditional view was entirely backwards in many places. In regions like Edessa and Egypt, what was later labeled as heresy was actually there first. It was a vast, chaotic mosaic of competing groups. So here is the tale of the tape for our historical battle royale today. We'll set the stage with the early Christian battleground, then introduce our two formidable challengers, Gnosticism and Marcion's radical movement. After that, we'll unpack the Proto-Orthodox playbook, and finally reveal exactly how they won ultimate institutional power. All right, starting off with Section 1, the early Christian battleground. Let's look at the 2nd century reality on the ground. It is incredibly important to grasp the absolute lack of structure in the 2nd century. Honestly, it was kind of the Wild West. There was no agreed-upon New Testament, there was no centralized church authority, or some pope calling the shots for everyone. There wasn't even a formalized creed. Defining Christianity at this point was a wide-open battleground of interpretations, with totally different factions all claiming to possess the true teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. That open landscape paved the way for our first major contender in Section 2, Gnostic mysticism, and their pursuit of secret divine knowledge. Now, Gnosticism is really a modern umbrella term for a bunch of diverse movements, groups like the Valentinians and Sethians. But they all shared a core belief, which was that salvation didn't come from a physical resurrection or an atoning death. Instead, it came through gnosis, which just means secret, esoteric knowledge. Following the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 CE, the problem of evil was a massive theological hurdle. Gnosticism offered an intellectually sophisticated answer to this. They believed the material world itself was literally a prison, and humanity had a divine spark trapped inside it. So you might be wondering, who built this prison? Well, the Gnostics pointed to something called the demiurge. They believed that the supreme, truly loving God was totally alien to our physical universe. The material world was instead created by a lower, ignorant, or even malevolent deity. They engaged in some radical interpretations of the Hebrew Bible, basically identifying the creator god of Genesis, who they often named Yaldabaoth, as this exact flawed demiurge. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how they took this logic to its absolute extreme. Because the creator god was seen as a flawed warden of a material prison, the Gnostics completely inverted the Old Testament narratives. Think about it. For them, the serpent in the Garden of Eden wasn't a deceiver at all. No, the serpent was a liberator. The serpent was actually trying to bring that secret gnosis to Adam and Eve, to wake them up from the demiurge's illusion. And because the material world was considered entirely evil, the Gnostics pretty universally adopted Docetism. This is the belief that Christ could not possibly have had a real physical body. He only appeared human. If you go and read Gnostic texts like the Apocryphon of John or the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus is portrayed as this disembodied revealer of secret sayings, just entirely detached from Roman historical reality. The Gnostics were a massive cosmological threat, for sure. But our next contender brought a structural assault. Section 3, Marcion's cut, and the radical schism he created around 140 CE. So Marcion shows up in Rome and absolutely shocks a Christian establishment with a completely binary theology. He forced a massive wedge right between the testaments. On one side, he placed the Creator, the God of the Hebrew Bible, who he viewed as severe, legalistic, wrathful, and the architect of suffering. On the other side, he placed the loving Father, the previously unknown, entirely good and gracious God who sent Jesus. Marcion said, look, these two could not possibly be the same being. And this brilliantly illustrates Marcion wielding the first textual scalpel. To back up his claims, he created the very first known attempt at a Christian canon. He outright rejected the entire Hebrew Bible.
He cut Matthew, Mark, and John because he felt they were too Jewish. He only kept what he called the apostolic, which was 10 letters of Paul, heavily edited to remove any Jewish references, and the Evangelion, a highly sanitized version of Luke. Basically, Marcion made Scripture itself the ultimate battleground. Faced with Gnosticism's secret knowledge and Marcion's textual cuts, a loose coalition formed to fight back. This brings us to Section 4, the Proto-Orthodox playbook. Historian Bart D. Ehrman coined the term Proto-Orthodox for this group, and the absolutely crucial point to remember here is that they weren't a pre-existing monolith. Their identity was constructed in reaction to their rivals. To survive, they synthesized a brilliant 4-part institutional playbook, affirming the physical creation, establishing a rule of faith, strictly closing the canon, and asserting public apostolic succession. Let's walk through exactly how they pulled this off. First up, theologians like Irenaeus and Tertullian aggressively went after the Gnostic hatred of the physical world. To counter Docetism, they vehemently defended the absolute goodness of material creation and the physical reality of Christ. Irenaeus argued that if Christ didn't have real flesh, well, then the Eucharist was just an empty symbol. And Tertullian drove the point home with this incredibly fiery question: what was born, what died, if it were not flesh? Second, they countered the Gnostic claim of secret, unwritten traditions by developing the regula fide, or the rule of faith. Now, this wasn't a formal, rigid creed yet, but rather a strategic summary of public apostolic teaching. It emphasized that there is only one God who is both creator and father of Jesus. It acted as a hermeneutical key, essentially a master decoder ring, literally dictating how Scripture had to be read so that nobody could pull that Gnostic inversion of Genesis ever again. Third, they closed the canon. Marcion's truncated Bible was the catalyst that forced the Proto-Orthodox to firmly define their own boundaries. Irenaeus argued there had to be exactly 4 Gospels, famously comparing them to the 4 winds of the earth. They demanded texts be written by apostles or their direct companions. This allowed them to gather a broad, comprehensive collection while deliberately excluding and labeling Gnostic texts like the Gospel of Thomas as apocryphal, which means hidden or secret, and therefore, in their eyes, completely illegitimate. Which brings us to our final stop, Section 5, winning institutional power. Because theology alone wasn't going to win the war, they had to adapt. Let's move to and see how this builds to their final strategic move. To combat Gnostic claims of secret, mystical enlightenment, Irenaeus mapped out a public, verifiable timeline. He basically brought the receipts. He traced an unbroken chain of authority from the original apostles, like Peter and Paul in Rome, straight down through successor bishops, right up to the contemporary leadership of his day. By rooting authority in public, institutional offices, they completely nullified any claims of private, secret revelations. But they didn't stop there. Sociological marginalization was a huge part of the strategy. The Proto-Orthodox developed a fierce rhetoric of heresy. They othered their opponents, tracing all dissenting thought back to a single villain, Simon Magus, from the Book of Acts. They didn't treat opponents as sincere thinkers. They portrayed them as demonic agents, motivated by pride. Tertullian even argued that heretics weren't allowed to debate Scripture at all because they didn't accept the rule of faith. It was a closed epistemological loop, ensuring the Proto-Orthodox could literally never lose a debate on their own terms. The Proto-Orthodox emerged victorious simply because they were the most institutionally robust and adaptable faction. They built a big tent ideology that could absorb diverse communities while strictly policing its borders. Ultimately, Orthodoxy was just the surviving faction of a fierce origin story. So, as you reflect on the structure of Western history over the last 2 millennia, I want to leave you with this provocative thought. If history is written by the adaptable, what other lost Christianities might have shaped our world if they had won the 2nd century? Thank you so much for exploring this amazing piece of history with me today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.